He cheated? Wrong. He was setting himself on fire to keep her alive. Everybody thought Leona had finally exposed her mafia husband, grabbed her money, and walked away like a queen. But the real bomb? Garrett never betrayed her in the first place. For 2 whole years, this man played the villain, used the enemy's daughter as bait, and let the woman he loved hate him just to keep her breathing. And the craziest part? The moment Leona thought she had won, she accidentally destroyed the plan that was supposed to save them all.
The document was presented as a stimulus, landing on the dining table with a finality that suggested a predetermined outcome. The subject, Leona Calloway, exhibited no physiological startle response. She maintained her position at the kitchen island as they entered. Garrett, the primary aggressor, performing a rehearsed cuff adjustment, a clear indicator of a premeditated psychological maneuver. He was followed by Monique Voss, whose crimson attire functioned as a display of dominance. Her nonverbal cues, including a proprietary survey of the penthouse, indicated a territorial and acquisitive mindset. Leona's gaze shifted from Garrett to Monique, then to the stimulus on the table. The subject engaged in a displacement activity, wiping her hands before approaching the table to examine the documents. The only auditory input was the low-frequency hum of climate control and a distant siren, a persistent environmental stressor of the Chicago cityscape. She processed the information with a notable lack of emotional expression. Garrett assumed a posture of observation, anticipating the subject's psychological collapse, a common expectation in such confrontations. Monique also watched, exhibiting signs of vicarious arousal. Leona returned the papers to the table, her gesture of smoothing them flat, a subversion of the expected victim response, instead signaling control. She then displayed a controlled, non-distressed smile. This was not a masking behavior for grief, but an external signifier of cognitive resolution. The smile appeared to induce cognitive dissonance in both Garrett and Monique, whose physical composure faltered. Their assessment of the situation was flawed. They failed to account for the subject's psychological evolution over the preceding 18 months. During this period, Leona had undergone a significant personality restructuring. However, the overarching dynamic was more complex. The perceived betrayal was a misinterpretation of a covert and as yet unrevealed shared objective. The ultimate outcome of this gambit remains contingent. A brief clinical note. The psychological dynamics under review are not isolated phenomena. The context of their reception varies. A morning commute, a moment of nocturnal introspection, diverse settings, a singular case study, a universal principle. If analyses of this nature resonate with your own observations of human behavior, subscribing ensures continued access. Your engagement expands the reach of this case file to others who might recognize these patterns. Sharing the data may prevent a replication of similar pathological cycles. We now revert to the subject's formative history, specifically the initial point of contact between Garrett Calloway and a woman from the South Side, whose background made her an anomaly in his world. Leona Marsh's developmental history is rooted in a third-floor apartment on the South Side of Chicago, within an environment characterized by sensory indicators of decay. Her father, Raymond Marsh, a welder, represents a significant early life trauma event. His death when Leona was 9 years old was sudden and industrial. The subject's primary memories of her father center on tactile sensations, his hands, and his pattern of emotional containment, a key paternal imprint. Following this loss, the familial emotional atmosphere shifted, but systemic collapse was prevented by the coping mechanisms of the maternal figure, Dorothy Marsh. Known as Dot, the subject's mother was a physically small woman who exhibited immense psychological resilience. Her profession as a seamstress required constant labor. She rose at 4 in the morning out of economic necessity, not preference. Her chronic pain, present since Leona was 13, did not impede her functioning until after 8 each night. Dorothy's parental instruction was not didactic but behavioral. She modeled stoicism, emotional regulation, and persistence in the face of systemic collapse. Her actions demonstrated a refusal to display vulnerability, even when the family's financial resources were critically low. A key cognitive intervention occurred when Leona was 14, following a bullying incident related to her socioeconomic status. Dot provided a single, calm directive. A quiet demeanor is not weakness, and stillness is a strategic tool. The most formidable individual in any social dynamic is the one who is systematically underestimated. Leona assimilated this directive, ceasing overt displays of emotional distress. This principle became an internalized covert coping mechanism. Due to financial constraints, she did not pursue higher education, a factor that shaped her subsequent developmental path. Leona possessed an innate aptitude for spatial and aesthetic organization, a skill not acquirable through formal instruction. She initiated a program of self-directed learning in interior design using publicly available resources. Her initial projects involved reconfiguring environments for neighbors under severe budgetary limitations. This demonstrated an early capacity for resourcefulness. Leona's core insight was that aesthetic value is derived not from capital, but from focused attention and the projection of care onto a physical space. A pre-relational baseline assessment of Leona Marsh at age 23 reveals a woman of low economic status but high ego strength, living with her mother. This psychological fortitude was a direct result of her mother's modeling of endurance and emotional containment. It was this well-developed internal framework forged by 4 a.m. mornings and a doctrine of silence that prompted Patricia Calloway's notable observation at the engagement party, an observation that would become a key data point in the Calloway family's history. However, that analysis is for a later session. Garrett Calloway's designated role was not to become a kingpin, but to be the heir to one, a critical distinction in the Chicago hierarchy. His father, Thomas Calloway, established the family enterprise in the 1990s, escalating from a single restaurant to a network of legitimate businesses. The criminal underpinnings of this empire were a topic of strict public avoidance. Thomas Calloway was assassinated 10 years prior by operatives linked by Underworld consensus to the rival Voss organization. Garrett was 27 at the time of this foundational trauma. Upon receiving the news, he exhibited extreme emotional suppression, a common trait in high-functioning sociopathy or individuals with severe trauma. He did not display grief, but instead issued strategic commands to his brother, Shaw, to secure their mother. This marked the beginning of his self-directed transformation into his father's successor. A decade later, at 37, Garrett Calloway's name was synonymous with a specific blend of fear and necessity in the city's psyche. He had doubled the family's assets, maintaining both overt and covert operations. The hidden operations, where subjects his legal team ensured were never committed to any permanent record. His methodology was not overt aggression, but strategic silence and decisive action, eliminating the need for repeated warnings. His mother, Patricia Calloway, age 63, resided in the Lincoln Park mansion. As the kingpin's widow, she held a powerful, untitled position as the family's matriarch. Patricia Calloway did not command through volume, but through the manipulation of social expectation and subtle, nonverbal cues. Her ability to place a teacup on a saucer without a sound could signal critical disapproval, inducing immediate anxiety in her audience. The subject's mother functioned as a single parent, following the father's progressive withdrawal and eventual abandonment. Shaw, the subject's younger brother at 33, managed the family's operational concerns with a subdued demeanor and an unspoken allegiance. The initial encounter with Leona occurred 4 years prior to the precipitating incident at a minor West Loop art gallery. The subject's presence there was not driven by artistic appreciation, but by the gallery's utility as a discreet channel for financial transactions. His attention, however, fixated on Leona before any artwork. He observed her attempting to hang a large frame with resolute independence, foregoing any appeal for assistance. The subject remained a passive observer for approximately 5 minutes until his presence was detected. Her reaction lacked deference. She stated simply, "You're early. The exhibition doesn't start until 6 o'clock." This atypical response reportedly induced a rare state of cognitive dissonance in the subject, leaving him momentarily unable to reply. The pairing was, on the surface, incongruous, defined by a vast socioeconomic chasm. Her background was working class. His was the apex of a criminal enterprise. Yet the subject perceived in Leona qualities absent in his environment: authenticity and a self-possession not born of fear. This precipitated a formalization of their bond within 8 months. At a celebratory event, Patricia Calloway, the subject's mother, approached Leona and publicly noted her inherent fortitude, adding a direct warning, "Don't you dare break it." The subject dismissed this admonition as histrionics. Shaw's nonverbal response, however, suggested a deeper processing of the statement. The subject would later recontextualize this moment as a prescient diagnosis. The subsequent 4-year marriage was a period of managed confinement for Leona within a space she curated yet could not escape. This environment was a penthouse apartment in a building the subject owned, with views over Chicago. Leona had converted the sterile architecture into an environment that elicited a subdued, almost reverent response from visitors. Her selections were guided by the principle of creating a living space over a mere showroom. The subject's associates, individuals of considerable means, consistently exhibited a brief, involuntary silence upon entering. This reaction served as external validation for Leona, confirming her efficacy within this limited domain. Aesthetic control was the sole variable Leona managed during the 4 years of their marriage. Her autonomy in all other areas was subject to a gradual, almost imperceptible erosion. This process began in the first year with the cessation of her employment, which the subject rationalized as a measure for her protection. Leona acquiesced. In the second year, her movements were placed under constant surveillance by security personnel, transforming all public excursions into monitored events. Progressively, her geographic and social boundaries contracted without formal decree. Her social network atrophied as individuals instinctively distanced themselves from the subject's high-risk environment. One friend, Nell Tucker, remained, but their interactions became heavily regulated. Leona's mother, Dot Marsh, was advised to reduce her visits via a communication from Perry Hayes, the subject's subordinate, who cited heightened security concerns. Marsh should call rather than visit. Leona processed the subtext of this directive. The completion of her enclosure had occurred covertly. The primary source of her psychological distress, however, was not isolation, but a profound internal void. An initial attempt to conceive after 1 year of marriage was unsuccessful. A subsequent round of IVF at an exclusive Streeterville clinic, characterized by its sterile atmosphere, also failed. The negative outcome prompted a 3-day period of somatic withdrawal as she processed a failure impervious to effort. A second IVF cycle 6 months later resulted in a pregnancy terminating at 7 weeks. During the onset of this loss, she experienced cognitive dissonance, focusing on the aesthetic quality of a countertop she had chosen. A third failure, 9 months before the inciting incident, left her feeling that the meticulously designed space was the most desolate place she had ever known. The subject's reaction to these failures was marked by emotional withdrawal. He offered no reassurance, instead increasing his time away from the residence, creating a palpable distance between them. While the environment retained its aesthetic perfection, Leona began to cognize her creation as a source of asphyxiation. The subsequent change in dynamics was not acute but insidious. It manifested in subtle behavioral tells, such as the subject placing his phone screen down, a gesture of concealment. Leona cataloged this observation without comment, consistent with her pattern of silent, precise data collection. This indicator was followed by others, creating cumulative psychological pressure. The subject's return times to the residence grew progressively later in a pattern of gradual drift. 10 o'clock became 10:30, then 11 o'clock, with his justifications decreasing as his absences increased. He began isolating himself for phone calls on the balcony, offering no explanation upon his return. A change in his personal fragrance was also noted. The subject adopted a sharper, more deliberate scent, a type often selected to make a new impression. Leona first detected this olfactory cue on a Friday evening. Her reaction was one of inquiry, not affection. The scent was an anomaly within their marriage. The subject also ceased inquiring about her professional activities. To Leona, this withdrawal of a primary bonding agent was more psychologically damaging than overt cruelty. The absence of this validation signified an irrecoverable loss. Consequently, the shared ritual of quiet evening cohabitation ended, replaced by a silence indicative of profound disconnection. A perceptible warmth had vanished. Post-dinner, Garrett would either sequester himself in the study, exit the residence, or occupy the sofa with a psychological distance more palpable to Leona than any physical barrier. His presence became a void, an absence far more acute than that of someone geographically removed. The initial evidentiary artifact was not a confession or a digital slip. It was discovered precisely folded within the inner pocket of a charcoal vest Leona was preparing for dry cleaning on a routine Monday. The document was a receipt from the Peninsula Chicago for a 2-night stay, including room service for 2, dated to the exact period of Garrett's supposed Miami business trip the week prior. Standing in the dressing room, Leona held the receipt and conducted a slow, deliberate 2-pass verification of its contents, not from a lack of comprehension, but to negate the possibility of cognitive error. She then sat on the bed's edge, the paper on her lap, remaining motionless for 20 minutes. There was no lacrimation, no somatic tremor, no attempt to contact an outside party. She processed the data in a manner akin to a patient internalizing a grave medical diagnosis, absorbing its implications, calculating its impact, and compartmentalizing what must change from what must endure. In this period, Leona's cognitions did not focus on Garrett. They focused on Dot. They focused on her mother, standing erect in the sewing shop at 4 a.m, swollen ankles, an unbowed spine, never resting until the task was complete. She contemplated the probable response of this maternal imago. Dot, were she present in a dressing room larger than their former shared apartment. Dot would never display vulnerability for an adversary to witness. Leona refolded the receipt along its original creases, returned it to the vest's inner pocket, replaced the garment on its hanger, smoothed the shoulder once, and then exited. She proceeded to the kitchen and commenced dinner preparations, Her hands were steady, her posture was erect. The daughter of Dot Marsh would not capitulate to a piece of paper. 3 weeks following this discovery, Nell Tucker requested a lunch meeting. Nell, proprietor of a Wicker Park flower shop, was 29 with loosely tied brown hair and hands perpetually marked by thorns and florist wire. She represented the sole remaining social tie in Leona's life, not severed by Garrett's security apparatus, likely because Nell's profession in floristry was deemed a non-threat. They convened at their usual North Side establishment, at a window table with ample light and a familiar menu. Yet on this day, Nell delayed her order. Upon sitting, she began to compulsively rearrange the silverware, a cycle of alignment and disarray. For the initial 10 minutes, Nell's discourse centered on meteorology, a weekend wedding floral arrangement, and the escalating cost of peonies. Leona listened, fully aware that these were all verbal diversions from the meeting's true purpose. Leona possessed sufficient experience with the silences of others to identify when a speaker was deferring a painful disclosure. Finally, Nell set down the cutlery, clasped her hands on the table, and, without making eye contact, stated quietly that she had seen Garrett with a woman at the peninsula's ground floor bar the previous week while making a delivery. Their proximity, she indicated, was intimate and required no further elaboration. Following the statement, Nell became silent, her hands still locked together. When she finally raised her gaze, Leona immediately identified the emotion in her eyes as shame. Not for any wrongdoing, but the vicarious shame of being the messenger of such intelligence. This was information no one wishes to deliver and no one wishes to receive. Nell had clearly rehearsed the conversation multiple times, finding no iteration that could mitigate the damage. Leona observed Nell. She did not blink, did not inhale sharply, did not move her chair. She reached across the table, making brief, light contact with Nell's hand, a gesture of acknowledgement, not melodrama. Then Leona stated, in a tone she might use with a supplier, "Thank you for informing me. And if you observe it again, please let me know." Nell was silent for 3 seconds. She had braced for tears, for hysterics, for a violent gesture, for the expected emotional collapse of a woman receiving devastating news. What she received was a calm directive from a subject sitting with a straight back, an untouched glass of water, and completely dry eyes. Nell's mouth opened, then closed, and she nodded. They proceeded to order and consume their lunch as if they were two ordinary friends, discussing peonies and the wedding, never again referencing the peninsula. That evening, after the kitchen was clean and Garrett was in the living room, his phone inverted on the armrest, per his nightly ritual, Leona entered the guest bedroom, closed the door, sat on the bed, and telephoned Frederick Harmon. Fritz Harmon, her estate attorney from the past 3 years, was a man of 50 whose chief professional asset was not legal acumen, but his core understanding that discretion is not a courtesy but a non-negotiable foundation. Leona's consultation with Fritz lasted for 40 minutes. She did not exhibit emotional distress. She posed precise questions and recorded notes in a small leather-bound notebook from her nightstand, a notebook Garrett had never inspected, his curiosity about her internal world having long since atrophied. After concluding the call, Leona remained seated for another 5 minutes, not for emotional regulation, but for strategic finalization. When she rose, opened the door, and walked past Garrett's static form without a glance, that decision was fully consolidated. The moment was devoid of noise or drama. It was simply a subject rising in silence to initiate a new course of action. Fritz Harmon operated from a small office on the 6th floor of a LaSalle Street building. It lacked prominent signage, a receptionist, or a lavish waiting area. Only a dark wood door bore his name in minuscule engraving. At 50, with short silver hair and always in a white shirt with sleeves buttoned, he had a practice of waiting a full 10 seconds after another person had finished speaking before offering his own reply. This was not a sign of slow processing, but of a meticulous weighing of necessity for every word he was about to utter. In his 3 years handling Leona's design firm contracts, no document had ever been compromised, no figure had been inaccurate, and no communication had been misdirected. Leona selected him for his unparalleled discretion, not his reputation. In the week following the late-night call, Leona visited Fritz's office twice. Both meetings occurred in the afternoon, while Garrett was geographically distant and she utilized a standard taxi for transport. Each session was contained within a 1-hour time frame. She brought the small leather notebook and a pre-written list of queries in a neat, compact script. Each question was targeted at a specific node within her and Garrett's shared financial network. Fritz listened, nodded, provided answers, and refrained from asking about her motives. He had enough professional experience to recognize that when a female client presents a list of questions regarding joint assets with completely dry eyes, the underlying reason is self-evident. Leona's strategy was not complex, but it demanded a rare level of patience. The interior design company she founded pre-marriage was registered solely under her maiden name, Leona Marsh, and Fritz confirmed it was legally insulated from marital assets. She left it untouched. However, the joint accounts, the commingled investment portfolio, and the 2 properties titled in both their names, these she began to systematically disentangle. The process was slow, legal, and executed one transaction at a time, with each withdrawal kept beneath the threshold that would trigger an alert to Garrett or his accountant. Fritz oversaw every step. Each transaction was documented. Each transfer had a plausible written justification. No action was illicit, rushed, or left a forensic trail that a passive observer would detect. Leona extracted her capital from Garrett's sphere of influence like a quiet, inexorable tide without announcement or drama, exploiting every available fissure with focused intent. She then unearthed a matter Fritz termed a significant liability, which Leona dismissed with such composure that Fritz had to reassess her grasp of the situation. The Lincoln Park property, titled jointly by Garrett and presented to her as a long-range investment, was encumbered by a development loan he had secured without her knowledge. To be precise, her signature appeared on the co-guarantor forms, yet Leona had never endorsed, seen, or been aware of these documents. Her name had been forged on loan agreements for a property whose true function was unknown to her. The sole individual with access to all relevant paperwork was Garrett. Fritz presented the open file on the desk before Leona, flipped to the page with the signature, and remained silent. For 15 seconds, Leona scrutinized the signature. It mimicked hers with near perfection, but the terminal stroke in Marsh was discernibly shorter. Leona recognized this anomaly from the thousands of times she had signed her own name. She knew the exact point of cessation for her hand. That was not her hand. She transported the file in her handbag to the penthouse that night, waited for Garrett's sleep, and then sat at the kitchen table, the papers arranged before her, until almost 2 a.m. She exhibited no anger. If it existed, the emotion was located at a depth beyond any surface expression. She analyzed every page, every stipulation, and every figure. Then she proceeded to the printer in Garrett's office, duplicated the entire file, and placed the copies in a manila envelope. She secreted it in the bottom drawer of a suitcase within the guest room closet, restored the originals to their exact location, and retired to bed. She initiated no confrontation with Garrett. She did not contact Fritz at 2 a.m. She merely integrated another data point into the psychological profile she was silently constructing and continued her observation. At home, their life proceeded as a performance where both had parts, but only one knew she was acting. Leona prepared meals, arranged the table, and escorted Garrett to functions among Chicago's clandestine elite, always in exquisite dresses she had selected, shaking the correct hands, smiling at opportune moments, and uttering the proper phrases. She was a flawless specimen of a kingpin's spouse, composed, supportive, and positioned precisely where required. And Garrett perceived that composure as docility. He interpreted that silence as acquiescence. He observed the woman seated across from him at every dinner and saw a consort who was entirely oblivious. He failed to recall her upbringing. He disregarded what quiet subjects do when afforded sufficient time and cause. They strategize. Monique Voss did not enter Garrett Calloway's sphere by chance. She engineered her arrival with the patience of one who understood that assets of true value are never overtly displayed. They are methodically approached. She was 30 years old, the sole heir of Conrad Voss, the patriarch of the Voss family, and a persistent adversary of the Calloways since the night Thomas Calloway expired in that parking lot a decade prior. Monique was raised on New York's Upper East Side in a residence overlooking Central Park with a monthly rent equivalent to a middle-class family's annual income. At 14, she was dispatched to a prestigious English boarding school near London. This was not due to her father's belief in education, but in his valuation of the geographic separation between his daughter and his methods of funding it. She returned to the States holding a business degree, a vocal tone that merged New York with a faint European quality and a profound, unteachable comprehension of power dynamics. She acquired this knowledge through observation of her father, at dinner tables where multi-million-dollar deals were sealed on napkins and where individuals vanished after a single misspoken sentence. Monique encountered Garrett at a charity gala in Chicago's city center. It was the yearly function where the upper crust and the criminal element converged in the same ballroom, under the same chandelier, holding the same untouched glass of wine, as they were all occupied with assessing one another. Garrett served as the keynote speaker that evening, positioned at the podium in a black suit, his steady, low voice compelling the entire room to lean in. This was not because his volume was low, but because his delivery instilled a fear of missing a single word. Monique was seated in the third row. She had researched Garrett prior to her arrival. She had studied the Calloway Syndicate, its corporate architecture, its real estate holdings, the public transactions, and the private speculations. She had researched Leona, the marriage, and their childless status. She was not the type of individual to enter a situation without adequate intelligence. Garrett was ensnared. He convinced himself it was a professional curiosity. He rationalized the dinners as networking. He classified hotel encounters as products of chemistry and happenstance, not of design. Men who construct empires often possess a remarkable capacity for self-deception. In many cases, this exact aptitude is what enables the empire's construction. What Garrett failed to grasp about Monique, or refused to, was her unwillingness to remain a clandestine affair. She had observed too many women in that role who subsequently aged into obscurity. She desired the residence, the status, the entire life, and she perceived Leona not as a competitor, but as a placeholder. She began to operate on Garrett's psyche with surgical precision. She never made a direct assault on Leona, an action that would activate Garrett's protective responses, however diminished they had become. Instead, she introduced subtle, patient, and calculated suggestions. "She still operates on a smaller scale," Monique would remark, reclining next to Garrett in hotel rooms with the sterile scent of air conditioning and room service. "I don't say it with cruelty, but you have surpassed that world. She continues to inhabit it, and comfort cannot share a bed with ambition indefinitely." She never stated Leona was inferior. She framed Garrett as superior, a far more effective proposition. Garrett, shaped by observing his mother's sacrifices, harbored a deep, unaddressed fear of stasis, of remaining stationary while the world advanced. Monique diagnosed this within the first month and systematically nurtured it each week. Concurrently, Leona was observing everything. By the 16th month of her covert preparations, soon after a receipt from the peninsula validated her suspicions, Leona possessed all necessary intelligence: the complete name, the affiliated company, the address, the social media profiles, and a photograph that Nell verified after a discreet and loyal inquiry requiring no second request. Leona examined Monique's photograph on her phone's screen for a prolonged period, not with animosity, but with clinical assessment. She immediately identified Monique's type: not theatrically malevolent, but strategic, a goal-oriented subject who equated acquisition with merit. She also grasped something further that caused her to set the phone down and gaze out the penthouse window at Chicago's darkening skyline. Monique Voss was Conrad Voss's daughter. This signified that the situation was far larger than infidelity, hotel rooms, red dresses, and sharp perfume. It was a power play, and Leona, Dot Marsh's daughter, the quiet woman whom no one in the room ever registered, began to realize she was not just preparing to dissolve a marriage. She was preparing to exit a conflict in which she had been unknowingly utilized as a pawn. We now revert to that Tuesday at the Gold Coast penthouse, to the moment following the smile that neither Garrett nor Monique comprehended. Leona stood with both hands on the table, the divorce documents lying between them like a newly drawn boundary. And the smile remained, but its nature had altered. It was no longer composure, but readiness. The readiness of a person who has waited an extensive time to speak, and the moment has finally arrived. She looked directly at Garrett and stated, "I have been anticipating this, waiting for you to do this in my presence because I required a witness." She then shifted her gaze to Monique upon uttering the word witness, and Monique, for the first time since entering the apartment, transferred her weight between her feet. Leona pivoted back to the kitchen island and opened the third drawer down, where she stored dish towels and oven mitts. From its very bottom, she extracted a brown file folder Garrett had never seen, as he had never once opened a kitchen drawer. She put the folder on the table next to Garrett's divorce papers and opened it. Inside were pristine printed documents chronologically organized, with each page marked by colored tabs. Records of financial transfers, property deeds, notices of dissolved shared assets, and investment withdrawal statements. 18 months of Leona's work resided within that folder. Page by page and transaction by transaction, she had executed every maneuver in absolute secrecy, directly beneath the notice of the man who governed half of Chicago but could not govern his own wife. "I signed divorce papers 3 weeks ago," Leona announced. "My version, my attorney already possesses it, so your documents today are somewhat tardy." Garrett stared at the folder, his jaw working, but he produced no sound. Leona paged through each section, speaking in the flat tone of someone reciting a grocery list. The Gold Coast property, separate from this penthouse, was transferred to my sole ownership 14 days ago, legally notarized and confirmed by counsel on both sides. The joint financial entity was officially dissolved in January. My client's capital contribution, 58% of the aggregate, was repatriated to her personal accounts. The corresponding joint account has since been terminated. My client's assets were extracted. The subjects remain. No assets were misappropriated. A caesura followed, not from a lack of data, but to create the necessary atmospheric pressure for the next disclosure. A report on the fraudulent signature applied to the Lincoln Park property loan has been dispatched, Leona stated, her vocal tone unaltered. Yet the ambient tension in the room shifted fundamentally. Not to law enforcement. Her gaze remained fixed on Garrett, unwavering. It was transmitted to your business partners and to your mother. The ensuing silence registered with greater intensity than any ambient sound in the space. It superseded the climate control system, the external sirens, any vocalization Garrett might have anticipated. Monique's focus shifted to Garrett, and for the first time since entering the residence, her composure exhibited a microfracture, a minimal but significant destabilization. You committed forgery, Monique initiated, the sentence incomplete. Affirmative, Leona confirmed with a clinical placidity akin to verifying a logistical detail. Garrett's facial composure disintegrated entirely. The subject's rehearsed confidence vanished, as did the calculated coldness of a Chicago magnate. What remained was a primal exposure, the expression of a strategist caught in his own meticulously constructed trap. Garrett attempted to speak. "Leona, you need to listen." Leona terminated his attempt, not with elevated volume, but with a calm, more psychologically devastating than any outburst. "I am listening. My listening phase lasted 2 years. It is the reason for my current state of total awareness." She retrieved both envelopes, arranging them on the table as if they were 2 case files detailing the same pathology from different clinical perspectives. "Your mother initiated contact with me this morning," Leona reported. "My disclosure was not the source. She acquired the information independently through the city's informal intelligence networks. An informant, possibly Nell, relayed the facts. What remains certain is that by tomorrow, your partners will have completed their review of the dossier I provided." Garrett moved toward her, a proximity-seeking maneuver. Leona responded with a measured step back, a pre-calculated distance maintained by a subject who had also rehearsed this confrontation. "Business is business, Garrett," she recited. "You indoctrinated me with that principle. It was a common refrain at dinner. Business is business." "Emotions are a liability." I documented everything with precision. Monique placed her clutch on a chair. Under normal circumstances, the gesture would imply an intent to remain. In this context, it suggested a need for a stability anchor. "What is the next phase?" Monique inquired softly. Leona observed her, not with animosity or disdain, but with the specific fatigue of an individual who has lost all tolerance for subjects failing to comprehend the gravity of their situation. "Now she ascertains the true cost of her acquisition," Leona stated. She collected her car keys and her handbag, a bag packed that morning in anticipation of this exact outcome. Her timing was based on long-term surveillance of Garrett's patterns. Knowing he would select the day following her mother's departure, he perceived himself as cunning. He was unaware she had achieved strategic superiority 18 months prior. She adjusted her blouse. "I will be residing at my mother's property," she announced to the room at large. "The house key is in its designated location. I have secured all necessary personal effects." She proceeded to the exit and opened it. The afternoon light flooded the space, vast and impersonal. Leona crossed the threshold, executing a clean departure. Behind her, Garrett Calloway remained static in his living room, holding legal documents that had been preemptively answered. He was surrounded by the artifacts of a life he believed he controlled, all of them now hollowed out. 3 days after Leona's definitive exit from the penthouse, Shaw Calloway piloted his vehicle from Wicker Park to his mother's Lincoln Park residence. The 40-minute transit occurred in absolute silence. He engaged no audio systems, initiated no calls. He simply drove, engaged in deep cognitive processing. Garrett had called the previous night. The call induced a 10-minute state of psychomotor paralysis in Shaw. Garrett presented a narrative typical of a subject exhibiting guilt, initiating with the projection of blame. Leona had become effectively blunted. Leona had withdrawn. Leona was incompatible with his new scale of operation. He spoke of Monique with the language of deterministic inevitability. "It was an emergent phenomenon, Shaw. These things occur." Shaw processed the data without interruption or counter-argument. He operated as a passive observer, allowing the subject to reveal his own deceptions. When Garrett concluded, Shaw posed a single diagnostic question. "Is Mom aware of the signature?" A pause on the line. "She is aware of a component of it," Garrett admitted. Shaw stated, "I will see her tomorrow," and terminated the call. Patricia Calloway was seated in the Lincoln Park Mansion's living room upon Shaw's arrival. She occupied the gray velvet armchair she had used for 20 years. Her posture was erect, her hands resting on an open Bible, but her gaze was directed outward, not at the text. Or perhaps her focus was entirely internal. A psychological space accessible only to matriarchs who have subordinated their lives to their progeny. A space where disappointment manifests not as volume, but as mass. A gravitational force pulling all adjacent elements downward. Shaw secured the door, her head turned. "Close the door," she commanded, despite its already being closed. Shaw understood she was not referring to the physical barrier. He sat opposite her. She bypassed all social pleasantries, proceeding directly to the primary inquiry. "The matter of the forged signature, is it factual?" This was not a question, but a request for final validation. It was a hypothesis awaiting a single data point. Shaw nodded. Patricia closed the Bible, placing it aside with the reverence of one securing a sacred object before handling a profane one. "I selected Leona," she stated. "I communicated this to him at the engagement party. I noted her structural integrity. You are aware of this, Mom. She has brought disgrace upon this family." Her voice remained steady, a quality that rendered the judgment more severe than any shout. The disgrace was not the other woman. Men exhibit cognitive lapses, but the signature, he weaponized his wife's identity for financial theft within this family. She paused, and the silence carried more weight than any subsequent vocalization. That weekend, Chicago's annual charity gala convened at a hotel on the Magnificent Mile, an event where professional and social domains intersect. Reputations are reinforced or subtly degraded via brief exchanges over cocktails and ambient music that necessitates close proximity for communication. Garrett appeared with Monique. This constituted his first major tactical miscalculation, not for appearing with her, but for doing so in a venue where his mother was also in attendance. The encounter was not engineered, it was a product of chance or a force more fundamental. The moment Patricia registered Monique on Garrett's arm, her expression solidified into one of finality. It was a state of absoluteness. Shaw, positioned beside her, identified instantly from a lifetime of observational data on his mother's emotional signifiers, an expression reserved for singular, irreversible events. Shaw made physical contact with his mother's arm. She was immobile. Garrett registered his mother's presence from across the room, and his skin lost all color. He moved toward her on instinct, Monique in tow, the reflexive action of a child approaching a maternal authority figure, regardless of transgression. "Mom, don't," he vocalized. The plea was both diminutive and futile. The immediate social sphere around them fell silent, as it always does, before an irrecoverable public pronouncement. "You brought her to this place," Patricia stated, "to this venue, before this audience, while your wife's name remains on documents you criminally falsified. Mom, please, not here." Then specified the appropriate venue. Her voice held its tone, but each word was delivered with discreet, unwavering certainty. "In the residence that is no longer yours, with the accounts that are no longer your accounts." Monique stood perfectly still. Patricia glanced at her once, not with malice, but with the detached sorrow of a mother observing the full living embodiment of her son's catastrophic error in judgment. She picked up her handbag. "I am departing. Do not bring that woman to my home. Do not contact me to advocate for you with your partners. You will bear this alone." She turned and walked away. The room's ambient noise did not resume for a significant duration. Shaw did not follow his mother. He remained. He looked at his brother, his expression not of anger but of something more profound, deep, empathetic pain. "She has not yet begun to cry," Shaw said quietly. "When Mom cries, the event is terminal." Then he too departed. Garrett stood isolated in the center of the gala. Monique was beside him, but the psychic distance between them had been irrevocably altered in the last 5 minutes. A wine glass, forgotten, was in his hand, and he began to process, possibly for the first time, the clinical definition of irreversible. The subject's partners responded with an expediency Garrett had failed to anticipate. Within 1 week of receiving Leona's file, a coalition of 3 allied families had underwritten the Lincoln Park development. These were individuals unaccustomed to acting on sentiment, only on assessments of risk. A forged signature on multi-million-dollar loan instruments was not a romantic entanglement. It was a criminal liability with the potential for systemic exposure of the entire network. Exposure was a condition none in that ecosystem could tolerate. Their counsel issued demands for a complete financial audit of all projects Garrett had authorized over the preceding 3 years. Garrett retained a lawyer, and then a second after the first reviewed the case and stated, with the calculated diction of a man insulating himself from future litigation, that the prognosis was considerably complicated. Garrett understood that, in legal parlance, considerably complicated was a synonym for catastrophe. As the Callaway infrastructure began to fracture internally, Monique Voss established residence in the Gold Coast penthouse. She presented herself 3 days after Leona's departure with 2 suitcases and the affect of one who believes they have concluded a prolonged campaign. She arranged her clothing in the closet Leona had vacated, hung garments in the dressing room Leona had conceived, and occupied the sofa whose upholstery Leona had selected. For the initial hours, this mimicked the sensation of victory. This sensation dissipated rapidly. The Garrett she had known, the public persona at the gala podium whose modulated voice commanded a room's attention, the man who spoke of ambition in hotel rooms, this construct was absent from the penthouse. The man in this penthouse conducted phone calls from behind a locked bathroom door, his voice so suppressed that Monique had to press her ear to the wood paneling and still could not achieve clarity. This man consumed his meals in silence, the only auditory stimulus being the contact of silverware on porcelain. His gaze did not engage with her. It passed through her, directed toward a locus she was not permitted to access. This man exhibited a startled response when unidentified numbers displayed on his phone, not the reflex of a busy professional, but of an individual anticipating adverse information. And knowing such information is invariably delivered from unrecognized sources. Monique had operated under the assumption she was inheriting a life. She discovered she was inheriting a crisis state. Her stay lasted 2 weeks, a period during which the penthouse's ambient sound decreased daily. This quiet was not the shared, consensual silence of two people. It was the quiet of a system undergoing a slow depressurization, like a compromised aircraft cabin whose breach has not yet been identified. Garrett initiated no physical contact, made no mention of the future, and offered no conversation beyond terse statements that he would be delayed, had already eaten, or not to wait for him. On the 12th night, Monique contacted her father, Conrad Voss. Her verbal output was minimal, or perhaps it was substantial, but delivered at a volume the penthouse walls failed to transmit. The following morning, she initiated her departure protocol. She folded the red dress she had worn upon her arrival. The garment, either an act of assertion or cruelty, was placed into her suitcase. As she maneuvered the case toward the door, she paused at the kitchen counter, removed a sheet from a notepad Leona had purchased, and wrote in a rapid, controlled script. "I'm sorry, this is a miscalculation on my part." That evening, Garrett read the note 3 times upon his return. Then he initiated a call to Shaw, who answered on the 5th ring. "She's gone," Garrett stated. "I'm aware," Shaw replied. "The partners," Garrett started. "I'm aware, Garrett." A pause. "How is Mom?" "She is stable," Shaw said. "She remains functional." She had one crying episode, the night following the gala, in the privacy of her room. I monitored it through the door. My presence was unknown to her. Shaw paused. This pause contained a weight greater than all his preceding or future words. "I have never observed Mom produce that vocalization. Not even upon Dad's death did she manifest that type of grief." The ensuing silence was the longest interval in the call. Then Garrett spoke, his vocal pattern exhibiting a complete structural collapse. The confidence, the decisiveness, the cold certitude of his kingpin persona had disintegrated. His voice was now an accurate representation of his state. A man situated in the wreckage of his own making. "I require assistance," Garrett said. "I know," Shaw replied, "but this is not a fixable scenario. No one can remediate this. You must bear this yourself." Shaw's statement was not delivered with malice, but with clinical truth, plain and unadorned. It was the manner in which a younger sibling addresses an older one, when both understand that the greatest kindness is not comfort, but brutal honesty. And because it lacked cruelty, its impact was heavier than any accusation. The apartment in Pilsen was on the second floor of a brick building on 18th Street, less than a 15-minute drive from the penthouse, yet a lifetime removed from it. Leona had secured it nearly 2 years prior, covertly, using funds from a private account Fritz Harman had facilitated. She had been staging assets there for 18 months, one case at a time, whenever Garrett was absent or not, paying attention, and he never paid attention, having ceased observation of the details of her life long ago. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a living area open to a kitchen with windows overlooking an alley. The furnishings were simple, not the simplicity of scarcity, but of a deliberate choice made by someone overexposed to beautiful things who now required only what was functional. A gray sofa, a wood table for two, white curtains she had fabricated herself. Any long-term observer of Leona would understand that for her to sew curtains herself was not an act of hiding. It was an act of constructing a defensible space. Dot Marsh visited 2 weeks after Leona's exit. She traveled from the suburbs, took a taxi, and ascended the stairs, not commenting on her knees, which were worse than the previous season. When Leona opened the door, Dot did not immediately embrace her. She entered, moved through the living room, observed the sofa and the table, and touched the curtains with her fingertips as a seamstress would, a gesture of both evaluation and respect. She assessed the order, the deliberate calm, the state of readiness the apartment projected. Then she stated, "Your preparation long predates the event." "You conditioned me for readiness," Leona replied. Dot occupied the sole chair in the room and observed her daughter for a prolonged period. Her expression showed no celebration or satisfaction, none of the joy of a mother witnessing an escape from a terrible situation. Instead, her expression was more complex, a mixture of bitterness and tenderness. It was the look of a mother who had raised a daughter to be a strong woman and was only now calculating the full cost of that strength. The years of required silence, the isolation of strategy, and the melancholia that accompanies a victory that necessitates losing a once believed reality. "Do you feel grief?" Dot asked. Leona processed the question with clinical honesty, not providing an immediate or socially expected response, but genuinely searching for an accurate self-assessment. "Yes," she said, "not for what was lost, but for my initial prognosis of what it could become." "That is the correct object of grief," Dot confirmed. They sat together as the evening light diminished and the maple tree's shadow elongated across the floor. They exchanged few additional words. Grief sometimes requires no language. Sometimes the women who conditioned us and the women we become can sit in proximity and simply respire, and that is sufficient. But there were unknown variables. There were facts known only to two men, and it is time to introduce their testimony. Shaw Calloway possessed partial knowledge. Perry Hayes possessed complete knowledge. And the truth they had contained for the past 2 years was potent enough to recontextualize every preceding event in this case file, from the phone on the armrest, the smile on Leona's lips in the penthouse that afternoon. 20 months prior, while Garrett was alone in his office reviewing financial reports, Perry Hayes entered and placed an envelope on his desk. It contained 12 photographs. Leona shopping. Leona consuming coffee at her preferred establishment. Leona exiting a florist's shop. Leona operating a vehicle on Lakeshore Drive. Each image was captured from a different distance, with a different lens, on a different date. Each was annotated with the time and location in the corner, with the precision of a professional surveillance log. The final photograph was not of Leona. The last photograph was of Dot Marsh before her sewing shop, her posture erect, holding a bolt of fabric, unaware she was under observation. With the photographs was a note whose precise script presented a single directive, prompting Garrett to enter a catatonic state for 5 full minutes. The communication originated from Conrad Voss. It was not a cinematic threat, but a clinical ultimatum. The proposition was a merger, which was a euphemism for the complete absorption and surrender of the Callaway network, territory, and legacy. The alternative was a demonstration of how Conrad could replicate the loss of Thomas Callaway upon the person Garrett most valued. Garrett recognized this was not posturing. Voss had orchestrated his father's death. The surveillance photographs confirmed Voss had been monitoring Leona for weeks, documenting her routines, her patterns, and the location of her mother. Garrett remained in his office until 3 a.m. that night, by which time he had formulated a response. This strategy required the systematic destruction of his most significant emotional attachment to ensure its preservation. Garrett adopted the persona of the betrayer. The rationale was severe but coherent. Leona's proximity made her a target. Her manufactured hatred and separation would negate her value as leverage, thereby ensuring her safety from Conrad Voss. Every late arrival home was a performance. Each instance of placing his phone, screen down, concealed strategic communications with Perry, not infidelity. His increasing emotional distance and disinterest in her life were calculated acts designed to methodically push her away. The objective was for her departure to appear self-motivated and organic, arousing no suspicion in Conrad. The new fragrance was a prop for this staging. Monique Voss was not a mistress. She was an instrument deliberately drawn into his orbit as Conrad's daughter to serve as an internal reporting channel, feeding her father a curated image of a weak, pliable Garrett. Concurrently, Perry Hayes was covertly liaising with the FBI, methodically compiling a dossier on the Voss organization's criminal enterprises. The forged signature, Leona discovered, was not an act of greed. It was planted by Garrett in a non-binding decoy document intended for Voss's informants to find and report. The authentic bank records remained clean, absolving Leona of any liability. This false trail was engineered to bait Voss into co-signing a guarantee that would directly link his offshore accounts to a federal money laundering investigation. By distributing the file, Leona unintentionally signaled to Voss that his leverage was compromised, forcing a violent, premature response. She dismantled Garrett's 2-year strategy, unaware of its existence, using the very intelligence and resolve he had always admired in her. The most devastating truth was not the plan's collapse, but the psychological toll of the intervening nights. Shaw was aware because Perry confided in him, unable to bear the burden alone. On many nights, after all communications were concluded, Garrett would sit in his office at 3 a.m, open his wedding album on his phone, and observe a single photograph of Leona smiling. He would simply gaze at that image, her face in the late afternoon light, her smile a product of her belief in him, a belief he was now systematically engineered to annihilate. Then he would lock the screen, place the phone face down, and resume his work. Perry witnessed this ritual repeatedly. One night, Perry sat with Shaw in the frigid Chicago air and articulated Garrett's condition. For 2 years, your brother has undergone a slow psychological death, not from the threat, but from watching her believe he ceased to love her. He has been forced into silence. The most inescapable prison is one constructed from the people you are trying to save. When Monique exited the penthouse, Conrad Voss lost his only surveillance asset inside the Calloway residence. And within 48 hours of the forged document reaching Garrett's partners, Conrad realized the trap had never been for Garrett at all. Garrett had been setting his own. The weakness, the distraction, the fixation on Monique, the entire 2-year display had been a meticulously crafted deception. Conrad Voss did not tolerate being manipulated. 10 years prior, he had ordered Thomas Calloway's execution and felt no remorse. The realization that he had been outplayed by Thomas's son, using his own daughter, provoked not shame, but a cold, potent anger that demanded immediate physical expression. Conrad initiated his assault on a Thursday, 3 days following Monique's departure, with a simultaneous two-pronged attack. The primary team was dispatched to the Gold Coast penthouse to eliminate Garrett. A secondary team was sent to the south side, to the third-floor apartment of Dot Marsh. Conrad operated on the principle that an attack on the mother-in-law is an attack on the wife, and an attack on the estranged wife is an attack on Garrett. Certain emotional connections persist beyond legal dissolution. Perry Hayes's intelligence saved them. He had compromised Voss's communications network 8 months prior, and this fragile link provided a 40-minute warning before the teams were deployed. 40 minutes. In their world, 40 minutes represents an eternity. Perry contacted Garrett, who then contacted Shaw. 2 calls, both under 60 seconds, contained only directives. Shaw's orders were to secure Dot on the south side and Patricia in Lincoln Park immediately. There was no time allocated for questions, only for action. Shaw executed the command in 20 minutes with perfect composure, a conditioned response from a shared traumatic history. He knew in such moments, action precedes cognition. Garrett did not retreat. He did not fortify his position in the penthouse. He, Perry, and 4 associates proceeded to the location. Intelligence suggested was Conrad's command center. It was a derelict warehouse near the harbor where the environment was a sensory mix of lake water, rust, and oil. He went not from a desire for self-destruction, but to execute the final gambit. If Conrad survived, the threat would be perpetual. If Garrett perished, Leona's safety would be secured, as her legal separation from the Calloway name rendered her worthless as leverage to Conrad, who would not expend resources on a non-asset. The events in the warehouse concluded in 11 minutes, a sequence of which no precise, first-hand account would ever emerge. In the 3rd minute, Perry sustained a gunshot to his left shoulder, but continued to engage his targets from a kneeling position with his right hand. In the 7th minute, Garrett was struck by a bullet to the abdomen from his left flank. As he collapsed onto the concrete, he experienced the temporal distortion commonly reported in near-fatal trauma, a phenomenon where the subjective perception of time slows dramatically. In that altered cognitive state, Garrett's focus was not on his empire, his wealth, Conrad Voss, or his 2-year strategy. He thought of Leona, not her smile from their wedding day, which was an artifact of the past. He visualized her calm, deliberate, unbroken smile as she accepted the divorce documents. It was the smile of someone who understood she had won. In her victory, he registered his own profound loss, not of the conflict with Voss, but of the war to preserve his relationship with the woman he loved, while being forced to orchestrate its destruction. That smile was the most profound injury Garrett Calloway had ever administered. He had engineered it himself through 18 months of calculated silence, emotional withdrawal, and sustained deception. Lying on the warehouse floor, his shirt saturating with blood, he registered that his death would cement that smile as her final perception of him. She would carry that belief for a lifetime, convinced of her own righteousness, never comprehending that her existence was the catalyst for his demise. Conrad Voss was neutralized in the 9th minute, not by Garrett, but by Perry. From a kneeling position with his last remaining round, he discharged his weapon one-handed. 2 minutes later, the strobing red and blue lights of federal vehicles saturated the warehouse. Their arrival deviated from the initial strategy, which Leona's data transmission had rendered obsolete. They converged because the evening's violence generated new forensic triggers. Gunshots logged by residents near Navy Pier prompted a local police response that revealed the incident's magnitude, necessitating emergency federal intervention. Upon entry, they discovered sufficient evidence of the Voss operation to dismantle the entire syndicate. The Voss dynasty imploded that night, not due to Garrett's meticulously constructed 2-year plan, but from a chaotic, violent, and imperfect sequence of events, the typical conclusion in that milieu. Garrett remained at the cold concrete near the harbor. His blood flow was decelerating as his system fought to conserve every drop. Paramedics were approaching as he observed the warehouse ceiling, seeing only a void. His final conscious processing was not of his own survival, but whether she would ever be informed. The communication occurred at 2:17 in the morning. Leona was supine in the Pilsen apartment, not sleeping. Her gaze was fixed on the ceiling, a state common since vacating penthouse. It wasn't fear. Night simply eroded the daytime defenses that suppressed unwanted cognitions. The phone's vibration on the nightstand illuminated Shaw's name. Leona responded because Shaw had never initiated contact, not once in 4 years. All communication had been routed through Garrett. A direct call from Shaw at 2 in the morning signified an event that could not be deferred until sunrise. A tremor in Shaw's voice was the stimulus that made Leona sit erect. Not the content of his speech, but the vocal instability. Shaw Calloway was a subject whose emotional baseline was unwavering placidity. If his voice was unstable, the fundamental order of things had fractured. Northwestern Memorial, Shaw stated, immediately. The 12-minute drive to the hospital left no mnemonic trace. She had no recollection of traffic signals. She could not recall any directional changes. Her awareness was limited to her hands on the steering wheel and the somatic sensation of a pulse in her throat, not her chest. Shaw was present in the emergency reception area, his complexion ashen. A dark stain on his shirt cuff, which Leona identified as blood upon closing proximity, was visible. His explanation was minimal. He reported only that Garrett was in surgery and that Perry required a consultation with her. He then escorted her to Perry Hayes's room. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged, his pallor consistent with significant blood loss. But his eyes were lucid, the lucidity of a man unburdening a prolonged secret on its final night. Perry observed Leona in the doorway and made no social overtures. He didn't inquire about her well-being. He simply commenced the debriefing. He began with the inciting incident, the 12 photographs, the unmarked envelope on Garrett's desk 2 years prior, the threat from Conrad Voss. He relayed each data point with methodical precision in chronological succession, omitting no details and adding no emotional inflection. Perry understood the gravity of this truth required no embellishment. Each fact Perry presented was a fresh psychological trauma for Leona. Garrett's infidelity was a fabrication, a calculated performance. First, trauma. Garrett's emotional distance was a protective measure. Every instance of coldness, every failure to inquire about her career, Each evening he kept to himself. He was creating distance to ensure her safety. Second trauma. Monique was not a paramour, she was an asset. Garrett leveraged Conrad's daughter to acquire intelligence and project an image Conrad expected to see. A compromised Garrett submitting to the trap. Third trauma. The forged signature on the Lincoln Park file was an entrapment device for Voss. When Leona exposed it, she nullified Garrett's 2-year operation, the very plan for which he had sacrificed his marriage, his wife's trust, his mother's affection, and his own moral integrity. The final, deepest, most penetrating trauma. And every night he was cold to you, Perry stated, his voice for the first time containing an element beyond fatigue. He was experiencing a secondary form of death, not from Voss, from the necessity of watching you believe he no longer loved you while being forbidden to correct the narrative. Leona remained in the hospital doorway under the sterile, fluorescent lighting. And for the first time since the narrative's inception, since locating the receipt, since Nell's disclosure, since uncovering the forgery at 2 a.m, since placing the folder on the table and smiling at Garrett, since exiting the penthouse, since telling Dot she was mourning a potentiality. For the first time, Leona wept, not with restraint, not in the controlled manner Dot Marsh had conditioned her to. She fractured like a collapsing structure, from the core outward, the internal framework failing before the facade. The sound of that grief propagated down the hospital corridor at 3 a.m. A nurse at the station registered the sound, then averted her gaze, her professional experience indicating when to intervene and when to permit a psyche to disintegrate. She wept from the total expenditure of her strength, her intellect, her patience, every attribute her mother had cultivated in her for 27 years, to annihilate the one person who was protecting her. She was the ideal weapon, aimed at the wrong target. Patricia Calloway presented at the hospital at 4 a.m. Shaw had summoned her. She entered the corridor wearing a long coat, her eyes dry, the expression of a woman who had exhausted her capacity for tears after the gala and would not display them publicly again. She observed Leona on a plastic chair, her eyes swollen, her hands locked in her lap. She sat beside her. She offered no physical comfort, no reassurances. She said, "He wasn't breaking your spine, he was providing support from the opposite side." Leona met her mother-in-law's gaze, and for the first time in 4 years, the two women saw each other not through their assigned familial roles, but as two mothers, one facing the potential loss of a son, one a husband, and the distinction between their griefs was almost non-existent. The doctor permitted Leona entry at 5 a.m. Garrett was on the bed, eyes closed, intubated. The monitor displaying metrics Leona could not interpret, though she recognized their steady cadence signified his continued viability. She sat, taking his hand, the one from their wedding, the one she'd served with divorce papers, the one he'd used to forge a signature to protect her while she perceived betrayal. And she began to speak. She disclosed every action, each call to Fritz, every financial transfer, every night she had lain in the guest room cultivating a silent, systematic hatred for him, the kind only possible for those who have experienced profound love. She revealed all of it, without concealment or excuse, because she owed him a truth reciprocal to the one he had withheld for so long. Then she articulated the sentence that would define her memory of this event for the remainder of her life. "I was so proficient at being strong, I failed to assess whether you were the one requiring rescue." Dot arrived at full daylight. She did not ask for an explanation. Observing her daughter beside the hospital bed, holding the hand of the comatose man, provided all necessary data. She took an adjacent chair and sat. She said nothing, simply remaining present. Sometimes the ultimate display of strength is not an action, but the quiet act of presence, an acceptance that some variables exist beyond the control of even the most formidable individuals. Garrett Calloway regained consciousness on the third post-operative day. The sterile white light and the monitor's rhythmic pulse were the initial sensory inputs he processed. The third was the pressure of a hand holding his. A slow turn of his head revealed Leona in the plastic chair, her eyes inflamed, her hair hastily secured, wearing the gray sweater he associated with domestic evenings when they still shared a sofa. She was observing him with an expression he had never before witnessed. Not the composed, strategic gaze he had known, nor the cold one he had manufactured over 18 months of performance, but the expression of someone who had wept to the point of exhaustion and had not yet recovered. They maintained silent eye contact for an extended period, a silence exclusive to two people who have inflicted deep wounds upon each other, where all words are too insignificant for the gulf between them, yet too immense for the confined space of the hospital room. Subject Garrett initiated communication, his vocalization labored, each syllable a study in somatic effort. "That smile," he articulated, referencing the day of the document exchange, registered as a greater psychological trauma than any ballistic wound. Subject Leona maintained physical contact, a typical response in trauma-bonded pairs. Her verbalization, "I thought you'd given up on us," suggests a fear of abandonment common in such dynamics. Garrett's response, framed by the physiological stress of exsanguination and a 3-day coma, presented a calculated shift in demeanor, a regression to a persona Leona associated with their initial encounter 4 years prior, a time of perceived vulnerability. His statement, "I gave up everything, except you," is a classic manipulation, reframing his self-preservation as a sacrifice for her. The subsequent process, labeled healing, was not a singular event, but a prolonged period of psychological renegotiation, marked by confrontational sessions where both subjects articulated long-suppressed grievances, a textbook airing of resentments common to codependent partnerships. The 18-month exit strategy and the failure to communicate were presented as mutual failings, a complex attribution of blame where both subjects claimed a degree of justification. This is the core challenge in resolving such pathological bonds. Not the absolution of a single transgression, but reconciling the conflicting, self-serving narratives that nearly resulted in their mutual destruction. The matriarch, Patricia, intervened during the second week of Garrett's hospitalization. Her posture was rigid, her expression a mixture of maternal anxiety and severe appraisal. Her directive was not one of emotional counsel, but of cold strategy. "Trust that girl enough to tell her the truth? A woman who can survive your betrayal can certainly survive your war," she concluded, clinically assessing Leona's resilience as a viable asset. Garrett's nonverbal assent, a mere nod, was assessed as a significant commitment, superseding prior verbal contracts. In a separate observation, a significant interaction occurred outside the primary subject's awareness. Dot Marsh and Patricia Calloway encountered one another, their first contact in 4 years. The subjects, matriarchs from starkly divergent socioeconomic ecosystems, a Southside seamstress and a Lincoln Park crime syndicate widow, paused, acknowledging a shared, unspoken territory. The bond between them was primal, rooted in the shared experience of raising progeny alone, under duress, and having recently faced the potential loss of that progeny. Dot initiated with the observation, "Our children are stubborn." Patricia's response, a rare and faint smile, was a confirmation of this shared genetic assessment. "They inherited that from us," she stated. The two then entered a period of shared, silent observation in the sterile corridor, a nonverbal pact between two matriarchs, a fusion of two lives into a single, untranslatable understanding. 1 year post-incident, subjects Leona and Garrett relocated to a Pilsen apartment, a significant downgrade from the Gold Coast penthouse, indicating a strategic reduction in their public profile. The new dwelling on 18th Street faced a maple tree. The subjects' new growth after winter served as a metaphor for their own state. Smaller, simpler, more authentic. Leona reestablished her enterprise, securing 2 new contracts, methodically rebuilding her professional identity. This was not driven by financial necessity, but by a psychological need to reclaim agency, a critical phase in recovery from a controlling relationship. This reinitiation represented choice, a stark contrast to the desperation of her initial efforts at age 23. Garrett divested from his criminal organization, ceding control of the Callaway empire to the subordinate Shaw, who had been managing operations covertly for 4 years. Shaw immediately began the process of legitimization, a strategic pivot Garrett was psychologically incapable of executing, his primary modality being conflict, not adaptation. The subordinate, Perry Hayes, survived the incident with lasting physical impairment to his left shoulder, a permanent somatic reminder of his loyalty. During a domestic observation, Leona was engaged in hanging hand-sewn curtains. Garrett positioned himself below, hands in pockets, a posture of passive observation. His comment, "It's crooked," was not benign but a subtle assertion of dominance, a micro-critique of her task. Leona's response, a smile, was not the calculated expression observed in the penthouse, but a new, adaptive mechanism, a de-escalation tactic developed to manage his narcissistic provocations without triggering a conflict cycle. "Everything beautiful is a little crooked," she replied, a statement of cognitive reframing, her rationalization for accepting a flawed partner. Garrett's subsequent laughter was only the second genuine instance observed in their history. The first occurred 4 years prior at the West Loop Gallery. Between these two displays of spontaneous emotion lay a significant history of trauma, bloodshed, and near-fatal events. On the kitchen table, the precise location where divorce papers were presented 4 years earlier, initiating this case study, now lay a different document, not a legal filing, not a strategic weapon, but an ultrasound result. The positive test, placed next to a cup of fresh coffee, signaled a new phase. Garrett's daily preparation of this beverage was a ritual, a learned behavior designed to demonstrate care through small, consistent actions rather than grand, manipulative gestures. Leona's consumption of the coffee represented her daily choice to continue the dynamic, a continuous act of forgiveness rather than a singular past event. This may be the most functional iteration of a bond between two such damaged subjects. A final clinical note: the quiet hypervigilance of a traumatized subject should never be mistaken for passivity. She is always observing. Similarly, the silence of a possessive subject should never be mistaken for disengagement. He never stopped. We have reached the conclusion of this case file. A final query for the observer. How did the psychological dynamics of subjects Leona and Garrett resonate with your understanding of pathological bonds? In your own clinical or personal observations, have you noted instances where prolonged silence led to negative outcomes, or where precipitous action precluded necessary inquiry? The most significant data often lies not in overt actions, but in the critical failures of communication between subjects. I invite you to log your analytical thoughts in the provided section below. Each observation adds to the larger data set. If this analysis proved insightful, indicate as much so we may gauge its utility. Forward this file to colleagues who may find it relevant, and if you wish to be notified of future case studies, subscribe to this channel for daily updates. I wish all observers of this case file optimal functioning, a stable state of well-being, and tranquility in your daily operations. The session is now concluded. I will present the next case file in our subsequent meeting.
He thought he broke her. He had no idea she'd been rebuilding in silence for 18 months. The envelope hits the dining table, and the whole room thinks it knows what happens next. Garrett walks in like a man carrying the final punchline. Monique follows in that red dress like she already owns the penthouse, the curtains, the future, maybe even the ghost of the marriage. And Leona, she stands there calm, picks up the divorce papers, reads every page, then smiles. That smile alone tells the audience one thing. Somebody in this room is about to get humbled, and it is not the woman being served. This is where the first life lesson punches through the glass. The quietest person in the room is often the one who has already survived the worst part in private. Garrett thinks he is dropping the bomb. Leona knows the explosion happened months ago. He thinks he is ending her story. She already wrote her next chapter. Leona did not become dangerous overnight. She was trained by pain long before luxury ever touched her life. She grew up watching a mother who woke before dawn, worked with swollen knees, and never let hardship turn into public theater. Dot taught her daughter that silence was not surrender. Silence was strategy. That is why when Garrett starts changing, Leona does not panic. She studies. He turns the phone face down. He comes home later. He starts smelling like choices that do not belong to marriage. He stops asking about her design work, and that one is brutal because sometimes the first betrayal is not cheating. Sometimes it is the moment someone stops being curious about the person they once claimed to love. Most people would have screamed. Leona reorganized. That is the second lesson. When emotion stops driving and observation takes over, pain becomes information. She finds the hotel receipt. Room for two, wrong date, wrong excuse, done. Then her friend confirms she saw Garrett with another woman. At that point, Leona is not even shocked anymore. She is clear, and clarity is terrifying in the hands of someone with discipline. So she starts moving in silence. Lawyer meetings, asset separation, paper trails. She untangles her life from Garrett's one legal thread at a time. The man who runs half of Chicago cannot even see his own wife erasing herself from his empire. That is almost funny. The kingpin can manage casinos, deals, pressure, enemies, and bloodlines, but he cannot read the woman sitting across from him at dinner. Classic. Then comes the forged signature. And that is where the betrayal goes from ugly to radioactive. Infidelity wounds the heart. Forging her name wounds identity. It tells her he did not just stop loving her, he started using her. In Leona's eyes, Garrett is no longer a husband who strayed. He is a man who crossed the final line. From that moment, she is no longer preparing for heartbreak. She is preparing for extraction. Then the big scene lands. Garrett brings Monique into the home, lays down divorce papers, and expects Leona to shatter in front of a witness. But Leona opens a drawer, takes out her own folder, and calmly reveals that the game ended weeks ago. She has already signed her version, already moved the money, already dissolved what was hers, already sent the forged signature file to his partners and his mother. That is not revenge, that is tactical demolition. And here comes lesson number 3. Never confuse composure with helplessness. Some people cry when betrayed, others smile because they already buried the version of themselves that needed to be saved. Garrett's face falls apart. Monique's confidence cracks. The room changes temperature. For one beautiful second, the audience gets the pure satisfaction of seeing arrogance meet preparation. Leona does not beg. She does not explain more than necessary. She leaves, door opens, sunlight pours in, she walks out. End scene. Perfect, right? Wrong, because this story is crueler than a clean revenge fantasy. The plot twist flips the whole thing upside down. Garrett never cheated. The distance was staged. Monique was bait. The emotional abandonment was theater. A rival family had targeted Leona and her mother. Garrett believed the only way to save Leona was to make her hate him enough to leave. In his mind, if she stopped being emotionally attached to him, the enemy would stop seeing her as leverage. Now pause, because this is where the story stops being just entertaining and becomes dangerous in a deeper way. Garrett loved her, but he chose secrecy over trust. Leona loved him, but she chose evidence over one last question. Both were strong. Both were smart. Both were acting from survival, and both nearly destroyed each other. That is the fourth life lesson. Love can still fail when both people are sincere, if fear is doing the talking. Garrett thought protection justified deception. That was his mistake. He decided for her. He turned her into someone to be managed rather than someone to be trusted. He thought pain now was better than death later. And maybe strategically he was not insane, but emotionally he became the villain on purpose. He weaponized silence. Leona's mistake was different. She saw the evidence, and honestly, the evidence was terrible. Her conclusions were not irrational, but once she entered survival mode, she no longer looked for truth, she looked for an exit. She was so determined not to kneel that she forgot strength can also mean risking one vulnerable question. She weaponized certainty. Then reality punishes both of them. Her actions unintentionally ruin Garrett's long-running plan. The enemy reacts, violence erupts, Garrett ends up bleeding in a warehouse. Perry is shot, the crime family collapses in chaos, and Leona reaches the hospital thinking she is coming to see the aftermath of some world she no longer belongs to, only to discover she has been standing at the center of it the whole time. When she learns the truth, she finally breaks. And that breakdown matters because until then, she had been all spine, all structure, all control, but some truths do not stab. They collapse entire buildings inside a person. She realizes the man she spent 18 months escaping had spent 2 years becoming monstrous in her eyes just to keep her alive. She was not wrong to protect herself, he was not wrong to fear for her, but they were both wrong in how they carried love. That is the final lesson, and it hits hardest. Silence is not always strength. Sometimes silence is just fear wearing expensive clothes. In the end, they rebuild, but not in the penthouse, not in the empire, not in the glamorous version of life that looked powerful from the outside. They rebuild in something smaller, truer, quieter, handmade curtains, morning coffee, a slower love, a life where nobody has to perform danger or dignity just to be understood. And honestly, that is why the ending works. Because the big house was stunning, but empty. The smaller apartment is ordinary, but alive. The betrayal was loud, the healing was quiet, the misunderstanding was dramatic, the truth was simple. And the real lesson? A person can survive enemies, scandal, humiliation, and loss. But if love becomes a place where both people hide what matters most, even the strongest hearts can turn into strangers under the same roof.